Stellar Blade, an IP unlike any other. If you like games such as FromSoft's Soul series, Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, God of War, and Nier, then this is a title that was made specifically for you. It was developed by an Eastern studio called Shift Up as South Korea's first major AAA game, and for what it was, they were pretty far with it. It started quite a reputation for itself by defying all expectations and normalized standards, becoming the PlayStation 5's highest rated game so far with extremely stylish gameplay, a highly inspired but fairly unique narrative, and girls that make those made by Tetsuya Nomura jealous. And with the amount of action and gameplay that involves and evolves from other great series, it's gotta have some great boss fights, right? And those bosses are, of course, the topic of today's video. Hello everyone, Primal here, and welcome to my ranking of all of Stellar Blade's bosses from worst to best. I've long been inspired by YouTubers like Democracy, Sunburned Albino, and Cytonox for the rankings they do on well-renowned video game franchises, especially those covering boss fights. And now with the release of this magnanimous title, the floor is finally open for me to do a worst to best ranking on a game like this finally, given in regards to the Soul series and all that, given that its gameplay is the core of it all. So with that all said and out of the way, let's dive right in! Royal Guard Keel is less of an actual boss fight and more of a mini-boss and learning tool of sorts, seeing as the only way to beat her is to knock her off balance by perfect parrying her so you can perform a retribution to defeat her. But out of all the mini-bosses I fought in my time, none have pushed me to the edge as much as her, so be prepared. She is seen guarding both Lavoir zones in the open world regions you visit and provides a fairly healthy challenge to those who dare enter the forbidden lairs of the Naytibas. As freakishly original as this thing's design is, it astonishes me how much the quality drops from the first two major bosses you fought so far to a much lesser but slightly more annoying foe. Let me just say it, non-humanoid enemies are just not fun to fight, at least not with the combat system that Sekiro invented. And the enemies that attack mainly with their head like this freak horse are by far the worst. Everything else is alright given that most of its attacks are ranged or can be seen from a distance, but its head swings are the most annoying thing given that the patterns are so intermittent and can barely be seen up close that one way or another they'll get you. Between this guy and his basic enemy version known as the Dozer, this is the more manageable version of the two. At least he seems easier to read and doesn't hunt you down to the ends of the earth like his hammerhead cousin would in the Wasteland. And then there's that optional awful gang fight in Eidos 9 with the both of them. It seems no one learned their lesson from Sekiro's Guardian Ape duo. I mean, they really could have thought of a much better fight that was more original to the area. At least the devs were kind enough to provide us the means and resources to deal with it properly, like Tacky mode and such to even the odds. Some of y'all may come at me for my placement of this one. Yeah, I'm sure a fair amount of you guys found this one to be one of the better fights in this game. But from my standing, I really couldn't make heads or tails from a single thing about it. Not its design, not its lore, and barely even its fight. A lot of its offense comes from ranged laser beams and annoying minion spawns that take away from the normal action of the up-close and personal sword fighting this game is known for. And it never really attacked me directly until I started getting into it with a combo only for it to catch me with one of its claw swipes. I unfortunately never had the opportunity to learn it properly up close because it mainly attacked me from a distance, and when it did I was busy dealing with something else like a minion or attacking it when it seemed passive. It really took away from the whole experience to where I didn't care much for it and decided to beat it on my first try and just forget it as a whole. You guys may think that this one deserves to be ranked lower given that this is a reused boss that serves as the main foe of both Lavoir Labs and the only way to fight is via your drone gun. Yeah, the ranged attacks may not serve as much purpose or entertainment as the game's core swordplay, but at least the devs were trying to make sure it had some decent purpose and involvement, and as basic and bland as this giant flesh slug is, it at least doesn't suffer from the flaws of the previous two entries. It's fairly aggressive in attacks and patterns that do all but completely overwhelm the player, and that alone is enough for it to be this high on this list, in my opinion. Behemoth has become more and more unoriginal as time has gone on, and many more games have put it to use, and this iteration really did not make it shine, even as an optional boss which also has lesser regular enemies variants of it all across the Great Desert. As I've stated before, non-human enemies are not fun to fight in games like this, but I will admit that this guy is a little better since he attacks with his claws and not just his head. You find this one as part of the final quest of Kaya's side storyline looking for her older sister Kara. And I think it's pretty obvious we all know what happened to her at this point, even before you find this hand-faced tiger. It's kind of sad that even though this is one of the more original monsters as a boss out in the open areas, it's the only real optional boss in the whole game and it doesn't feel impactful, and the fight really isn't that good. It doesn't even have an end quick time cinematic like all the others. There's hardly anything special about it. If there were other optional bosses like it that were also unique in their own way but ended up being somewhat better fights in their own right, I'd feel a bit more comfortable having this one in the game. But since there aren't and he's the only one, it makes the experience of these areas lacking. I'm glad that there's an original optional boss in this game, but given what it is, I just wish there was more or the fight was better. You can think of this boss in either two ways. If you've been having a little trouble with the fast-paced action combat of this game, then this will be a nice change of pace. He moves very slow, so he could give you more of an opportunity to learn his fight. Or maybe his slow and slightly inconsistent patterns may throw you off your game, and it can be kind of annoying, especially with the amount of unparryable attacks he has compared to most other major foes. A fair amount of those can be pretty tricky to read, especially his jump and double swing, which makes it look like his second is unblockable. Don't let his sluggish stature fool you. You cannot be greedy with this one. Just be patient and watch his movements so you can respond more accordingly and have a much easier time. Given that he appears as just another typical brute enemy, he should present a fairly familiar formula to veteran players, but still best be prepared because he will definitely bring the heat at the king of the parasitic skull natives you've had the pleasure of getting to know in this dungeon. I'll admit, it was kind of hard for me to determine a proper place for this one. Given his lack of actual hands, it felt like the parrying combat system felt somewhat superfluous to his assaults. Later on, however, after my time carefully learning his fight, and the one optional encounter he has in the waist, it felt a lot better and my opinion changed drastically. When he's first introduced as the first major boss of the game, I couldn't really make heads or tails from his attacks yet, and a lot of the info you have yet to learn on how to deal with enemy attacks hasn't been taught to you yet until later in the first major level of the game in 807. Fortunately, Taki is there with you to help carve up this Mancubus ripoff. And plus, the more fleshed out optional encounter feels more like the full version of the boss if you want a second chance, which in turn balances out the negatives of his initial encounter. He may not look like anything special at first, but when you do spend more time with him, he actually has a pretty good start to the game's bosses, even if his design isn't anything special. Plus his pacing doesn't return to form from the last century. You know, there are a couple encounters that while they appear or actually are separate entries, they do happen within the same space as the one that came before it, and if I were to rank them separately, then one side of that coin would more than likely be lower than the other. But really I have no real reason to do that, so they'll all go together in the same spot of their initial encounter. So our number 10 entry is a long foreshadowed Elder Naytiba, who happens to be your dear friend Adam, who rescued and has been helping you all along your journey up until this point. Well, maybe a little earlier than that. Real surprise there, since the originality of anime plot tropes has long since passed at this point in time. The final boss you fight depends on your choice at the end of the final conversation you have with him. Should you choose to reject his offer, which one most likely logically would, he will be your final opponent. The first phase starts out with you just beating on him, given that he really doesn't want to fight you and is still trying to convince you to work together with him. He may bat you away with his wings, but he really doesn't do anything else aside from that and teleport. When you first beat him down, Lily will try to help, but at this point he stops holding back and Thanos snaps her exosuit and transforms into his true form, and the real fight begins. Given the drastic change between fights and the checkpoint in between, it can definitely feel like two different encounters. But given that they really are one and the same, there's no reason to have them separated as stated before. Between the two final bosses of the game, Adam as the Elder Naytiba definitely fits the vibe of it all more, given his presentation and build-up from the get-go. Though he really likes to play cheap with you, a lot of his attacks look manageable with his various basic melee, even though he does warp in and out of it sometimes. But he also has a lot of unblockables that are really dismal to deal with, like his instant light ring, which then follows up with a wing slap, and his leaps and lunges you can barely see coming. His insta-kill is fortunately more manageable, as he does not try to overwhelm you like another encounter on this list. At the end of it all, if you get good enough to survive this epic encounter, you're treated to the epic finisher at the end and his satisfying death scene. Though the ending for this route truly is a questionable one. Should you choose to actually accept this hand, which is surprisingly the good route for once, you're most likely treated to a much better conclusion with awesome new angelic Elder Naytiba powers and our next entry. So if you actually do take Adam's hand, you're treated to a boss that feels less like a final boss but more of a secret super one. Providence feels easier to read and fight, but it moves like a hawk and hits like a truck. 2 to 3 hits from this thing, even at max stats, will put you down for the count. So you have to have the eyes and instincts of a cheetah to pay close attention to what it does, because you really will only have a second to react accordingly. His melee rock'em sock'em punches are of course the most manageable as always. He has some pretty intimidating shockwave attacks that look completely unavoidable, but I think even if the effect looks higher than you, all you really have to do is jump. His insta-kill is truly the easiest of them all, given his targets are front and center for you. But the best part of all, despite his girth health, once it reaches a certain point at only a third, this fight turns into an event where you unleash the full extent of your powers and take him apart in your new Elder Angel mode, with an even more epic finisher. And Lily's fate and all depends on if you fill her bond bar to 100% and do her optional level quest in Eidos 9. While this one may feel less like a final boss, the encounter and conclusion to it all definitely feels better than the previous entry. What a rush is really all I can say for this encounter. Every moment with this corrupted battle droid is one to remember, from your first slide down one of the most hellish obstacle courses I've ever done to the final encounter in the Space Center. This guy will keep your adrenaline going non-stop until you're done with him. Though he really doesn't have much going for him aside from a few mix-ups from your classic parry and attack routine, being able to throw you off him during your aggro, and a regeneration gimmick where you have to decrease his health 3 times to actually get to the point where you actually beat him with an overcharged railgun blast via quick time, and an AoE blood explosion he does every now and then. None of his negatives really take away from this encounter, especially with that banger soundtrack he has, and nothing about him really feels cheap. Probably the only non-humanoid enemy I actually enjoyed fighting, but that's only because his attacks come from more his hands than his head, even though he does attack with that big donut grinder he has, which he rarely did, and a lot of it was dealt with via your blink maneuver. And all his other unblockables were mainly done from a distance, which you could see coming and still have a small amount of room for air like I did. I find it amazing that I did as good as I did, but even more so that Shift Up actually made bigger foes for us to fight and did a better job with them with the parry mechanic than the ones who invented it. He does have a section optional encounter with many new attacks that completely threw me off my loop from the first time, and I heard that some of those attacks he uses in the first encounter, but that never happened to me. I probably just got lucky, but he wouldn't be the first case of that in this game. But aside from all that, not bad for the very first Alpha Naytiba battle, even though he feels as basic as most other boss encounters in this game. Everything that I said about Belial can definitely be said for this guy too. The only difference is he has more to offer in terms of a boss given his wider range of offense and mobility. His encounter was what sold me on the entire game during the demo at the end of March. Nothing about him ever really felt unfair. His unblockables and attacks with his head were either distant charges which he could easily avoid via dodging in quick time, and the rest of his moveset was extremely punishable for what it was, allowing huge windows for you to use more of Eve's stylish moves against him. And the music and cinematics during this encounter were top notch. The final boss from the demo and second main game one overall. The one who set the streak of amazing boss hits in this game until Corruptor straight after. Truly a clash to remember. It's when you reach him that you start to see more of the Sekiro Souls boss formula, because he has it all from basic melee to dodge and parry through, and massive AoE and ranged attacks of effect to avoid. Nothing about him ever felt cheap, but there was still a lot for me to learn from this game at the time, and my fight with him could have felt much better. Fortunately, he has a second encounter to fix all that. The encounter I had long been expecting since I went back to catch up on this game's trailers and marketing since discovering it, and it did not disappoint at all. But it did indeed subvert my expectations extremely. Whether good or bad, I cannot say. I initially thought she was going to be a full-on big bad for this game and not just corrupted by the Naytiba contamination. I also expected her to have more than one fight in this game, which unfortunately didn't happen, but the one they did for her really exceeded my expectations. But it did feel a little lacking given how little screen time Big Sis Taki gets and how early on it all is in this game, especially her boss fight. Fortunately, they make up for all that by giving the players what they want by giving you Taki mode, which is this game's equivalent of Devil May Cry's Devil Trigger, which gives you her weapon, suit, and powers. And the end moment between Eve and her sister figure was really touching for what it was, even though it was generic and didn't make me shed a tear for once.
Of course. My sister.
Here we finally are, guys, the one that really set my bar standards for this game. By the time I reached it, I was at the pinnacle of all the entertainment value. It's just a crying shame there weren't any more bosses like this guy in this game, because everything about it was just pure epicness, from the design to the fight, the music, even the spectacle section at the end, which had me hoping for something a little bigger like that in terms of a full-on fight. But this was just perfect for what it was. Nothing he did ever felt like it couldn't really be handled with this game's core mechanics of swordplay and parrying, even though he doesn't really start out with a weapon initially. But then it gets even better when he does, as he pulls out his own angelic moonlight greatsword from his wazoo, and then it's on the levels of Ludwig the Accursed Holy Blade. His AoEs and ranged attacks were all easily learnable and a sight to behold, and get even crazier without getting difficult later on, while the band in the back goes full Trans-Siberian Orchestra. The Retribution and Finisher were the most cinematic of the entire game, and it gets better because once you beat him, you move on to your real foe. This massive Lovecraftian parasite named after a Stranger Things monster, and one I now believe is an actual creature in dark myth and lore, is the real alpha boss, the Demogorgon, while the Democrawler you fought just moments before is a common pawn for it. Kind of like that reveal from that Godzilla anime series in the late 2010s. At this point, you're falling to Earth from space after it throws you out of the orbital elevator, but Eve, who is too stubborn to die or leave her work unfinished, unleashes the full power of a railgun on it to finish it off. The giant winged wad has no real offense, but the threat has never been more real, as time is short before you enter the thermosphere completely and hit the ground, and every shot has to count while you're literally giving your own life to kill it, all while the choir goes off the rails. You really cannot get any better than that. Well, except in maybe my last two entries here.
많이 늦었어, 이거. 자연이 이렇게 된 건 결코 너 때문이야. 인간의 언어를 하다니.
And now we've arrived at the other boss fight I was long expecting since the demo, and probably the most personal entry on this list. This is the Naytiba that killed our sister Taki, and the encounter I knew for sure would happen later on. And let me just say that this one was full of surprises. Quite a few good ones too. I was not expecting the encounter to be so late in the game. I thought it would happen a little before or after the halfway mark. And the fact that she was intelligent and could actually talk really threw me off guard. But that just plays into our last surprise at the end of this one. She has a lot of versatile attack patterns, and a fair amount of them can catch you by surprise when you first see them, but they all hit that sweet spot to where you can easily learn them later on if you pay good enough attention to see them coming. Her insta-kill move is probably the most painful to stop because she throws the whole kitchen sink at you, which gets worse as time goes on. It's kind of sad that the devs never really gave this one an actual name like every other boss on this list. I was thinking maybe something along the lines of Reaper or Reaver or something like that. But the end of it all is the most satisfying part of it all, as the finisher goes full Samus vs. Ridley, and this monstrosity is really revealed to be our #1 entry right as we segue into her. I think that we can all agree that the girl who indirectly becomes our arch-nemesis through the crime she's committed against us while building up to her through her video diaries is definitely the peak of quality in terms of boss fights and the game in general. I mean, was there any real doubt? She may only have one encounter, but given how much of a presence she has since the beginning, it feels like we've known her from the start. Without all that build-up, this encounter would have fallen a little flat even with the amount of quality and action she has to offer. And the more time you spend with her, she shows you more of just how unhinged, crazy, and evil she really is, despite being a puppet like us, who is only a tool and wronged by her master, Mother Sphere. Everything about her feels perfect, from her character, to her fight, to her music, which is the best in the game, being a Korean rave. She's like a Soul series version of Virgil from Devil May Cry, if Virgil in this case was a hot Korean android chick. She can even do her own version of Virgil's Judgment Cut, which we also can in the form of Tempest Burst skill. Not a single one of her attacks feel like they're really unfair. They all have a good enough wind-up for you to see coming and parry and dodge accordingly. Her Tempest and Shockwave attacks are a little hard to react to given how fast they happen, but they're really nothing you can't recover or learn from. The fast-paced but fair action of this whole fight is the pinnacle and definition of Stellar Blade. And then there's the epic and satisfying finisher where Eve severely disables her and leaves her on the ground crying as a bloody paraplegic after everything she's done to us and the world in general.
릴리, 가자. 이브, 거기서 어서 끝을내! 이브, 이브!
Well guys, with that, this list has officially come to a close. I'm truly glad and thankful that I could do a project like this for y'all finally. So what did y'all think of this list and Stellar Blade in general? Do y'all agree? Who is the best and your favorite bosses in your opinions? While the future of Stellar Blade looks uncertain right now, we can all feel the glimmering rays of hope that shine on us from it. And despite everything, I truly can't wait to see more and where this title goes from here. So with that all said and done, I hope you all enjoyed, and I shall see you guys in the next one. Peace!